Let's get started. This is the conservation session for Saturday afternoon, the first one of two. And I'm Bob Cooper from the University of Georgia. I'll be the session chair. And so our first talk today is by Andrew Barnas, and it's entitled Evaluating Behavioral Responses of Lesser Snow Geese to Unmanned Aircraft Surveys.
Figures here from a couple studies that have tried to do this, and it often results in just flying drones at wildlife and seeing what happens. And that ends up becoming more of a question of, well, what impact does the drone have on birds, rather than the survey protocol that we should be using, some sort of standardized transect survey. And that's really what I'm going to be trying to get at today, and actually trying to characterize and quantify any sort of behavioral responses that we do get. And specifically, how these responses may change on days with flights versus no flights, and then also altitude. Presumably, the lower you fly, the more of a response you should get, and how might any behavioral responses change with altitude. And if we're seeing any sort of behavioral changes, is it actually because of the survey, or is it because of some other extraneous factor? And hopefully, at the end, I'll have time to get into that a little bit more. So this study was done in the Postflight National Park in northern Manitoba, and for those of you not familiar with the National Parks of Canada, shame on you. This is up in western Hudson Bay, and there's a picture of the habitat here. I mean, it's really just desolate tundra. There's really no visual obscurities there for aircraft surveys, and it basically equates to just snow goose purgatory. It just goes on forever and ever. And so speaking of snow goose, that's our study species that we chose to use. This particular population has grown substantially over the past 30 years. Pardon me. And this has really led to some intense habitat degradation. And this is just an exposure fence here that shows snow goose, goose, and so there's a real biological need to monitor these guys. And that coupled with just the really expansive territory that they take up, it makes them a really good candidate species for using something like an unmanned aircraft. So our aircraft isn't one of those quadcopters. It's a fixed-wing survey-grade aircraft, and it's distinctly different. But at the end of the day, it does equate to just a Sony camera mounted in a styrofoam body. And it is battery-powered. There's no gasoline engine in any of this. And the way it flies is really free of human error after the planning stage. It takes these, you can pre-program these flight paths that are basically like mowing your lawn, and you overlap each transects, and it takes images all along the way, and stitches them together post-flight to make these really high-quality mosaics that we can get a lot of good spatial information from. So in 2015, we were able to do 20 flights over 12 monitored nests. And just this past summer, we were able to do 9 over 28 nests. We got a lot better at it. But unfortunately, I'll only be talking about the 2015 data because the 2016 data is still on a bunch of SD cards in my desk. So really looking forward to that. And because we are interested in altitude, we flew at 3 different altitudes at 75, 100, and 120 meters above ground level. And for any of the Americans in the room, that's 250 feet to 400 feet. But come on, meters. All right, so we have our flight paths and how we are actually flying, but how do we actually look at what our birds are doing? So of those 12 monitored nests that I talked about, we set up basically surveillance cameras that allow us to get 24-hour continuous video. And that's really good for detecting behavioral changes rather than something like time-lapse photography. So of those 12, 9 we surveyed with the aircraft, and 3 we left as controls that had no flights over them. And that's really important for any sort of behavioral studies. You need a control group. And we made sure, with great effort, that these nests were sufficiently far apart to avoid the sin of pseudo-replication. And I think we did well on that. And if you haven't noticed, there's the camera. Relatively well camouflaged in my mind. And I hope that was a shock. Like, aha. Maybe not. Anyways, so you get this video, and of those 20 flights that we did in 2015, we were able to get 14 viable observations. That's basically where things went according to plan. Batteries live long enough to let us get video. And so we take this video and we review it 30 minutes before launch, obviously the entire flight period, and then up until an hour after landing. And even though that's a lot longer than when we're actually in the air, we felt that that's really strongly encompasses like the entire flight period, because there's more to a flight than just flying, as anyone who's been delayed in an airport knows. And so we obviously reviewed this video on days of flights, but also days before and after flights, and that gives us a good baseline behavior of what our birds are doing, and any residual effects that might occur the day after. And we are just talking about simple proportions of time spent on different behaviors, and so I'll just go through a few of those that we were interested in. This is nest maintenance behavior. This is basically any time that our goose is just contributing vegetation to the nest, preening, egg turning, basically picking it down. And this is just genuinely a happy bird, just doing goose things. Just really quite content there. Sleeping or resting. This is the bird's asleep. There's not a lot of complex things going on there. And then there's something I call low scanning. This is our birds really passively scanning their surroundings. It's a relatively low activity behavior. There's not a lot going on behind the scenes here. This is more reminiscent of undergraduates in an entry-level bio class. Or maybe it was the previous one. And the next one is high scanning. Our goose is actually rapidly scanning her surroundings. Her neck may be raised and the head's elevated. And it's important here that we're not talking about different motivations behind doing these different behaviors, but just feeling that these behaviors are distinctly different from each other. And I felt that that was a fair assumption to make here, that this high scanning is different from low scanning. And I hope you all agree. Now head cocking, this is a really important one because we're going to be talking about this a little bit later. But the bird actually appears to be looking at something high in the sky. And it may occur in just rapid little ticks, or it may be prolonged. And just watch her carefully here. She's going to give a couple of good ones. What I'm actually talking about. See right there? And then one more. And I know there's another. There we go. Yeah, so keep that in mind. And then there's our off-nest behavior. Now, there's 2 different types here. The one on the left, the bird is taking the time to cover the eggs, which is really important. Birds take recess events during incubation. This is perfectly normal. But goose on the right, it's actually the same bird. But on the right here, she doesn't take the time to cover, house is on fire, leave the kids. And you actually see the eggs are uncovered. So I don't know what happened there, but she was not happy. I think that's fair to say. So for these proportions of time, conducted a repeated measures regression and Proc-Mix program stats. And all that means is we're just trying to account for the individual variability that may exist between birds. A goose is not a goose, it's not a goose. All birds are different, and some may react differently than others. And again, we're just interested in presence or absence of a flight, altitude, and then that period within a flight operation that we'll get into at the end. So let's look at some numbers. For how birds are responding on days with flights or no flights, it really becomes apparent quite quickly that our off-nest behavior and head cocking changes substantially. Birds are spending about twice as much time off their nest on days with a flight than not, and this head cocking behavior goes up about 4 times on days with flights or not. The rest of the behaviors don't really change substantially, so I think for the rest of it, we decided to focus on these 2 top behaviors here, and just seeing how those ones might change in response to the other things we're interested in. So, okay, things are changing on days of a flight, we get that, but how might altitude affect things? Now again, presumably the lower you fly, the more of a response you should get, and that just sort of intuitively makes sense. But that's actually not what we saw. 75, 100, 120 meters basically elicited all the same responses. The blue here is our off-nest behavior, and it's relatively constant, regardless of the altitude. Head cocking in red was marginally significant, but I don't like to talk about things in terms of significant. I mean, just visually and intuitively, this sort of is all basically the same, but it is distinctly different from days without flights. And so that's weird. And it just doesn't make sense from a behavioral point of view. So we thought, okay, it's a flight. So what's going on? What's consistent? It did work. So if we, again, think about that flight period as being broken up into 3 parts. The pre-flight, where we're just arriving, setting up gear, and before takeoff. And then the time when we're actually in the air, so pre-air. And then post this about an hour after landing, things become a little bit more clear. So this head cocking behavior just goes through the roof when the aircraft is actually in the air. So I think it's fair to say that birds are probably noticing this thing as it's flying overhead. And why that is, I can't really talk about motivations behind this, but all that's happening is you get a change in behavior. Now off-nest is really interesting because it does sort of appear to go up linearly as the flight operations are taking place. But I wouldn't read too much into that because it seems to be an artifact of, well, birds are probably leaving, a lot of birds are leaving in response to us just arriving on the scene. And the fact of the matter is if you're off your nest here, you're probably likely to be off your nest here, and then even more likely to have stayed off your nest there. So I think it's fair to say that birds are probably likely to leave nest in response to human operators, namely me, rather than the aircraft itself. And that's actually kind of comforting because really right now with drone work, we're restricted to what's called visual line of sight, and what we really need is something called beyond line of sight operations. Right now we have to keep an eye on the aircraft while it's in the air, which really limits us to about 1 or 2 kilometers of operation. And what we really want is to be able to fly long distances and basically sit at home and sip a cup of tea while the birds are unaware of this aircraft flying. But really, the point of the matter is that use of UAVs or drones should be dictated by biological questions and standard survey protocols. And what this really means is we have a responsibility as scientists not to just be flying drones because of their sex appeal. And yeah, I really think that we just need to think about how we're actually using these and how they may affect the wildlife that we're interested in. The next steps in this are just basic validation of nest counts with ground truth data. And we're also interested in sound measurements. So we do have audio recorders out there that may detect our vocal responses of birds and the actual sound of the aircraft as it flies overhead, and maybe that's impacting them as well. And with that, I'll acknowledge all the people that made this possible, and I'll take any questions. Bye.
Yeah. Have you considered like having a hawk or something and see how that relates to their behavioral change with the drone?
Yeah, like the fixed wing stuff is that it has a big shape of a predator, eagle, hawk, or whatever.